Welcome to the Leading Lives podcast by Hallmark Productions, here from our studio in Dorset called The Log-In. Imagine being a surgeon and all the trauma that you see and face every day. Then magnify that by taking those skills to a war zone. I don't think many people could cope with that. Well, with me today is one of those surgeons, Professor Tas Qureshi. Tas, welcome. You and I have known each other for a good few years now, and I know how highly regarded you are. Just give me a little bit about your day-to-day life as a surgeon.
Hello, Chris. Thanks for inviting me to do this. So I'm a general surgeon. I'm a keyhole surgeon, and traditionally I've done laparoscopic surgery, which is the old-fashioned keyhole surgery. But as you all know, more recently, from 2015, I've been doing robotic surgery, which adds a lot more sophistication to what I do. I mainly deal with people with bowel cancers, but also have an interest in endometriosis, inflammatory bowel disease, as well as the more mundane things like people with gallbladder problems and hernias.
In recent times, you've taken those skills overseas to Gaza, haven't you? You've been there for a few years.
So my journey to Gaza started in 2019. I was actually approached by a British charity because people with cancer in Gaza struggle to access healthcare. So I was asked to upskill surgeons within Gaza. Now, that's not a controversial or a political statement. I was doing that within the UK, as you well know. I was part of the LAPCO programme set up with the Department of Health, and I'd train other consultants within the UK to improve the quality of cancer surgery.
It's important to say that we're not going to go into the politics of war, but we're simply going to focus on the human element and the effects on ordinary people. There's no judgment in this interview. We're going to leave all of that to others. But I've got a feeling that the next few minutes are going to fly by because we've got an awful lot to cover. This year, at the beginning of the year in 2024, you went over to Gaza again, didn't you? Tell me about that trip.
So as part of my upskilling surgeons within Gaza, they're called surgical missions, and I've been on a number of surgical missions to Gaza in order to make sure that people can access healthcare and surgery for cancer. And my next surgical mission was scheduled on the 14th to the 19th of October 2023, and obviously with what happened, that mission was cancelled. But then I was put on standby, and I was asked to be one of the first emergency medical teams to enter Gaza. So I had a phone call on the 31st of December. On the 6th of January, I was on an aeroplane to Cairo. And in Cairo, there was 2-day security training. I went on behalf of MAP, Medical Aid for Palestinians, but also IRC, International Rescue. And then from Cairo, we then crossed into Gaza, a journey that took about 10, 12 hours. And it was a very different existence, which I'm sure we'll explore during this interview. But yes.
Yeah. Tell me about the fighting that was going on in January.
So this was at the height of the war, as you know. It was incredibly intense. And during the security training, we were made aware of the fact that in any other war zone or conflict zone, as an NGO, the trigger to extract the NGOs or the volunteers is about 30 kilometres. The fighting gets to within 30 kilometres. As you may well know, Gaza is just 40 by 12 kilometres. So that's a completely different remit. So within Gaza, the fighting had to get within half a kilometre before they consider extracting the volunteers. So hearing missiles and guns and airstrikes within half a kilometre is really quite hair-raising. I have to say, yes, it's hair-raising, but you do become acclimatised to it, and then you start concentrating on what you have to do because the trauma of what you're seeing outweighs the trauma of hearing guns and missiles and airstrikes.
Tell me about the kind of injuries you were seeing at that time.
So again, the majority of this was airstrikes, usually on residential buildings. The majority of people we were seeing were just women and children. Now, one of the problems in Gaza is it's very populous. Now, we know that pre-conflict, it's the most populous area in the world. 2 million people within 40 by 10 kilometres, there or thereabouts. Because of the conflict and the way things were handled, these 2 million people were herded or sort of constituted into much smaller spaces. So that meant that travel between short distances took an incredibly long time. And it's not just because the infrastructure was destroyed, the roads, it's just the fact that there were so many people. So therefore, it's not like the UK where you can dial 999 and ask for an ambulance, and that doesn't exist there. You really rely on all sorts of transports. I've seen people on the back of motorbikes come in estate cars, on the back of horse and carts even coming into hospital. So you can imagine that process takes time. But that has an impact on the sort of injuries that we were seeing, because people with major bleeding in the chest or the abdomen, which is what I would deal with, would take just too long to get to hospital and they would not survive the journey. So that affected what we saw. As a result of that, 70% of the things that we saw were either orthopedic injuries, so that's broken or amputated legs and arms, or burns, because however traumatic that may be, people can survive a reasonable amount of time in order to get to hospital. We did see lots of people with bleeding and more terrible things within the chest and within the tummy. And usually it was shrapnel. And the sort of things that we were dealing with was bleeding into the chest. And if you bleed into the chest, there's not much there. There's a lung and there's a heart and there's big blood vessels going away and towards the heart. So it was dealing with that. Within the abdomen, usually it was shrapnel and bullet and airstrike injuries. Now I say shrapnel. Now shrapnel you might think is tiny ball-bearing sized things, but I was taking bits of shrapnel out that were the size of a grapefruit from somebody's chest, for example. So really quite big. A lot of the shrapnel, in many ways, that's much easier to deal with because you've got a big lump of something that you can take out. When you've got little splinters of shrapnel going everywhere, it's literally like taking little pieces. I don't know what, just it's more difficult to pick out. And usually that will pierce the bowel, and you'd have lots of holes in the bowel, lots of holes in the liver, lots of holes in the spleen, and it's trying to deal with that. I can't describe it any more than carnage, and it's trying to deal with that.
Now, in the hospitals, there was a lot of people seeking just refuge because they were hospitals. These people had a name, IDPs?
IDPs. So IDP stands for internally displaced persons. I just want to add some pretext here that, we see images of people carrying their belongings over their shoulder, disheveled, shoes that are broken. And it's very easy to just assume that these are people that are uneducated. These are people that Gaza has got the highest number of PhD students per capita in the world. These are mostly educated, eloquent people that just happen to be victims of circumstance. So these IDPs, they're not just people who are homeless that are looking for somewhere to stay. They are displaced people. So they've been displaced many times over from their houses and are just seeking refuge. The reason they'd seek refuge in a hospital is it was deemed to be a safe place. So if you've got a hospital with international NGOs, they thought, well, this has got to be a safe place. I can come with my wife and children here and I should be safe. So that's what an IDP is and why they stayed in the hospitals.
This particular hospital was NASA Hospital?
That's correct.
Yeah. Am I correct in thinking that NASA Hospital was actually temporarily shut down because of the war? Is that right?
Yeah, it was. I mean, as you know, a lot of the hospitals have been hit by the airstrikes. NASA was no different. I was in Gaza between the 10th and the 18th of January within the hospital and left a couple of days afterwards. And about a month later, there was an incursion from the Israelis into the hospital. And they came and, a lot of things were done. So a lot of staff were abducted and taken away. These are people that I would work with. And I now know, because I've been back, as you know, since then, I've seen the graves of a lot of the mass graves that were found, 300 to 400 people with their hands bound, and most of them in surgical scrubs. So I can only assume there were people that I would have worked with. You don't remember every face that you work with, but undoubtedly there would have been people I would have worked with.
You said that you were there from, was it the 10th to the 18th of January? And what about your travel into Gaza and travel out of Gaza at that time? How difficult was that?
It was long, but it wasn't actually difficult at the time, because at the time we were coming through the Rafah crossing, which is through Egypt. And Cairo to the Rafah crossing took about, 8 hours. And there's 8 checkpoints, and it was the checkpoints that took time, and it was all red tape. But after that, once you're through the Rafah boarding, you're then into Gaza. The first thing and then a UN convoy would take us to our respective safe houses, or assumed safe houses. The first thing that you notice when you're in Gaza is a smell. and I now know that's the smell of munitions. The other thing that you hear is the sound of drones all the time. That's what I heard last time. We were taken to our safe house and it was dark. And then the next thing we saw was a flare go up. The Israelis put a flare up to see what was going on. So this then becomes second nature. You start becoming acclimatized to these things. The safe house that we were in, I mean, again, people may know or may not know that Gaza is actually a very nice bit of real estate. It's on the Mediterranean. And at any other theatre, it probably would have been a tourist resort. And in days gone by, many, many, many years ago, it probably was a tourist resort. And there were these holiday homes for people. And because they're holiday homes, they're quite widely spaced. And they're on the sand because they're close to the beach. So the British military, amongst other people, the British government, assumed that these would be good to be used as safe houses because they're so far away from another house. Nobody could make a mistake, if the house was hit, to say, well, I'm really sorry, we were trying to get the building next door, we accidentally got your building. But also because it was built on sand, you can't build tunnels on sand, so that can't be used as an excuse either. So quite a good choice as a safe house.
Moving forward, you came back to the UK and went back to your day job, as I say, or day jobs in your case. And what was the driving force to take you back there in October?
So I've been a number of times since 2019, and these people, whatever anybody says, I've met them in person, and these are decent, honourable people that I've met with pride and dignity. So they've really become not just acquaintances, but friends. And when a friend's in trouble, most of us will go and help a friend in trouble. But there's also just an inner drive. Why did I do medicine? It's to help people, and I can't then say that there's caveats to that, and I only help people in a certain circumstance. So that's what it was all about. Why Palestine? Because I've been going there. The charity knew me. I knew the people that were in trouble there, and it was my way of helping them, really.
Whilst you were there, we did keep in touch, not very often, but we did keep in touch, and I could clearly see that you were under a lot of stress. It must have been a pretty horrific time for you. How long were you actually there on your second visit?
So 1 month. So previously the missions were two weeks, but for reasons that I can't explain and I don't know, they've been changed to 1 month missions. That's had a rebound effect because the number of people that can commit to a 1 month mission has reduced. So the number of NGOs is reduced. I was lucky with the support that I got with the people and colleagues around me that I managed to take that 1 month off. So it's 30 days. But now, as you know, Rafah's destroyed. So it wasn't through Rafah. We then went through Jordan and Oman, had our security training there. And then from Oman, we went to the Allenby Bridge, which is the border between Jordan and Israel. We then had a police escort in a bus through Israel for 2.5 hours, 3 hours, until we got to the Karam Shalom crossing, which actually is adjacent to Rafah. But it used to be a port, but now they're actually putting people through and across into Gaza from there. So from Karam Shalom, those of us that had PPE, so Kevlar jackets and helmets, use those, and then you're in armoured vehicles, and then you go to the UN headquarters within Gaza, and you wear that not for any other reason than airstrikes are happening all the time, tanks are being fired all the time, and it's some comfort that you've got this on, but you and I know that if you're hit by an airstrike or a tank, it's unlikely that a helmet and a Kevlar jacket is going to help you. And then from the UN headquarters, we then went to our relevant and respective safe houses.
What about the differences in the hospital and the environment around the hospital when you went back second time? Just outline that briefly.
I mean, the best way I can describe that to you is the journey from the safe house to the hospital. The first time, you noticed a lot of people, you noticed, overcrowding, you noticed shelters, but you also noticed neighbourhoods that were like any regular neighbourhood that you'd see in the UK. That was back in January. This time, honestly, I've said this a lot of times, it felt like I was in a surreal existence because I drove from the safe house was driven from the safe house to the hospital. Only did that once because I then stayed embedded in the hospital for the whole 30 days, stayed there morning and night. But I couldn't believe the level of destruction that I saw from the safe house to the hospital. And maybe my mind just works differently, but it looks surreal. It looked like a Hollywood film set to me. And the film that sprung to mind was War of the Worlds, how the aliens come, they just completely flatten the earth. And it just looked like these neighborhoods have been flattened, indiscriminate sort of areas that are just completely razed to the ground. And that's just the buildings. Obviously, there's a human cost to that as well.
What about the hospital itself and lack of supplies?
So the hospital was allowed to reopen after the Israelis left on the proviso that there'd be no IDPs in there. So actually, there were no IDPs in the internally displaced people, but it was still incredibly overcrowded because I think NASA's got something like 400 beds, but there's perhaps 400 to 500% occupancy. So you've got people within one bed space, beds going along the line of the bed rather than across. And so you've got 3 or 4 people in that one bed space. And their relatives were also allowed to be with them. So it's incredibly overcrowded, the hospital. The sanitation was difficult for those reasons. Water's in short supply. The hospital was running on a single generator, not regular electricity. Normally you'd have regular electricity and 2 generators as backup. This is running on 1 generator, and I'm told that no spare parts are allowed to come in. So therefore, the grace of God, this hospital is running on that single generator. The thing the Gazans and anywhere in the world that's impoverished, people become incredibly innovative and just make things work. So that's what they've been doing for the year. Within the actual theatre environment, sometimes there wasn't scrub to wash our hands. Sometimes we didn't have gowns, theatre gowns. We usually had gloves. Now, gauze and Gaza, people may not know that Gaza is famous because actually they do a lot of weaving and the woven fabric. And so the word gauze actually comes from Gaza. Now, the way I explain how a surgical gauze works is if you have a puddle of water and you use a sponge, the sponge absorbs the fluid, just like a regular car sponge. If you didn't have a sponge and you just had a piece of cotton, you'd have to wring the cotton out a number of times to get that same puddle to be absorbed. Swabs are like the sponge. They absorb the blood and allow you to see. So, for example, if I were to do an operation on the tummy, often you're talking about 5 litres of blood coming out straight away. So from within that, you've got to find the hole in the dike that's causing the blood. Sometimes it's multiple holes, but, I hope that's not too graphic, but I'm just trying to demonstrate at a point. If you've got that sponge or that gauze, you can mop up a lot of the blood quickly. But sometimes we didn't have gauze and we were cutting up cotton shirts or some of the table covers that we had in theatre in order to mop up blood. So you can imagine what that would be like. It was suboptimal.
Suboptimal's something of an understatement. Yeah. There was different kinds of patients that you were dealing with this time as well?
So, the intensity of fighting was still there. But what I was seeing and saying when I was out there is that for 1 year, because as you know, I was there for the 1 year anniversary, October the 7th. For 1 year, the whole healthcare system has been put on hold and it's been concentrating on the trauma patients. And it's the right thing to do. There's no criticism there. But if you actually are quite callous about it and look at actual numbers, the numbers are huge and in some would say unacceptable. But it's maybe 5% of the population have been affected by trauma. Either they've been injured or killed by it.
Because although Gaza's obviously such a very small geographical area, it's very densely populated, isn't it? Isn't it the most densely populated place in the world?
Yeah, as we said earlier in the interview, it's the most populous area in the world. And certainly in October, that whole population has now been constituted into 1/10 of the space, into 10% of the space. So therein lies one of the problems.
What about the long-term sick then? That presumably from what you're saying there, that they would have had virtually zero medical attention.
Exactly that.
So somebody suffering, say, with your discipline, particularly cancer, that must have had a massive impact on their life expectancy or other possibilities of recovery.
Yeah, so as I say, 5% of the population affected by trauma, and the whole healthcare system has been geared towards them out of necessity. But that means that 95%, the very great majority, have been ignored for the year. So there are people with regular illnesses, regular diseases, that may well die of those regular diseases. and they go down as natural deaths, but they're indirectly affected by the fact that there's a conflict and they've not been able to access healthcare for a year. So within my own discipline, what I tried to do while I was out, there was a number of things that I did. Of course, I dealt with the trauma. I tried to reignite the education system. So medical students, every day between 10 and 2, I'd give lectures to the medical students for an hour, but also to the trainee surgeons. And it was interesting that they're so interested in learning that actually the consultant surgeons would come as well. So 10 to 2 was my time to do lectures every day, and if trauma allowing, obviously. And then around that, I'd be fitting in operations, if it was trauma. But what I also tried to do was keyhole surgery. Now somebody might say, well, why would you bother doing keyhole surgery in a war zone for cancers? It's because the outcome's better, but also because there are so many infections, lack of antibiotics within Gaza. People with big wounds on the wards were just languishing there because their wounds had broken down. So with keyhole surgery, with much, much smaller wounds, that's less of an issue. And actually, thankfully, the things that we did with keyhole surgery, they went home. But it's I learned very quickly, the doctor was saying, yes, we've got patients with cancer, and they had lists of patients with names. I said, right, let's get them in. I can assess them and decide what needs to do or needs to be done. But, you then remember the reality check is that person with the cancer is actually living in a tent somewhere, and they may have been displaced from that tent. So then you may not know where they are, and there's no mobile signal. So actually it proved almost impossible to find the patients or the list of patients that they had. So then what we did was we relied on people that were coming in with advanced cancer as an emergency. But also, of course, from within that list, we did find some patients. But I made alliances with the endoscopy department. That's where cancers are diagnosed. And we would bypass a lot of the red tape. So I'd see these patients really quite quickly, get them scanned quickly, and decide whether or not they're fit for an operation. The reality check, a lot of the people that I saw, because the access to healthcare was delayed by so long and so much, they were inoperable by the time I saw them. So they often had cancer that spread already to the liver and the lungs, which, arguably, if I'd have accessed them a year before, they'd had healthcare access a year before, you could have avoided that and got the cancer out in time.
What about malnutrition? That must have been a huge problem too.
It's a big problem. So, we as NGOs lost a lot of weight. That's not a complaint, it's just an observation. We went in with our eyes open, but we were only there for a month. So these people have been there for a year, with food and water being withheld. The guy that was tasked to look after us, our minder, he wasn't really a minder, but it's the only word I can think of using. He showed me a picture of him before the conflict, and he was 83 kilograms. And if you were to see him now, you wouldn't recognize him. He was 61 kilograms. He lost 22 kilograms in that 1 year. The most stark example I saw of that was a 15-year-old boy that was brought in while I was there. Sorry, he's a 14-year-old boy who weighed 15 kilograms.
15?
15. So just to put that into context, my son, plays a lot of football, so he's fit. He's 13 and he weighs 38, 39 kilograms. So that's your reference. But just going to the malnutrition, that has implications for people's outcomes when you do surgery, because if somebody's nutritional status is poor, their reserve is poor, and their ability to withstand big operations is reduced. So the outcomes are poor. So again, another reason to do keyhole surgery. Now, it's very easy to say keyhole surgery, but I kid you not, I was doing keyhole surgery almost because the fibre optics for the instruments that we were using was so poor. So it was like operating with a candlelight. And then some of the instruments that we were using just weren't working properly. So it really brought out the innovative nature within me and the team that was helping me.
Do you think it's made you better as a surgeon?
It's made me appreciate what I've got here. Sometimes we know this, yeah, people say this, but you don't appreciate what you've got until you don't have that anymore. And whatever we say about the NHS, we still have things that are, as good as it gets.
I've heard you talk about 3 phases of problems that you're going to see in Gaza. Can you just tell me what that means?
Yeah, the Gazans have been, troubled, attacked, whichever word you want to use, at 3 levels. The acute which is the short term, the medium term, and the long term. The short term attack on the Gaza is bullets and planes and missiles and dying from trauma. The medium term is because of lack of food and water coming in. There's an embargo on those things, so they don't have food and water. So they are therefore becoming malnourished, but also the lack of antibiotics, the lack of sanitation, the overcrowding also means there's infectious diseases. So in fact, as NGOs, we took our polio vaccinations because they've had their first case of polio within Gaza, which is a tragedy. But other infectious diseases are also taking hold. So that's taking out people in the medium term. But the future of any society, I would argue, is the children and the educational systems. Most of the universities have been destroyed. A lot of the professors, if they've not been killed, they've been abducted. And so actually the children, they've lost their childhood and they've lost their education. One of the journeys I did from the safe house to the hospital the first day, as I said to you, I only did that journey once. You saw this destruction, and within this destruction, there was this slab of concrete. And on the slab of concrete was some graffiti with some Arabic on it. And it was translated to me to say that we want our childhood back, we want our freedom back. So these are children who are, honestly, they're growing up too quickly and they're having to be, fathers, brothers, replacing fathers and brothers that have been lost. You see children with plastic containers walking, dragging them along the street to wherever they can find water. If it's a water tanker, it'll be a water tanker lorry. If it's a tap, it will be a tap. And then they're dragging these back across God knows how many kilometres back to home just because that's the only water they can access. So that's what I mean about the long-term future, is that the children have lost their childhood, but their future has also been lost because actually the educational institutions are not functioning for whatever reason. They're destroyed or the teachers aren't there anymore.
What psychological effects has your experiences had on you? I mean, you're a father yourself, as we know, and I know you've operated on children of similar ages to your own children, so that must have been really tough for you.
So when I'm out, what surgeons are very good at is actually staying objective, because if I become emotional, I lose my objectivity and therefore my decision-making is compromised. So one thing I've always been able to do is just stay objective within the theatre of trauma. Even though it's the theatre of trauma and war, I stayed objective purposely. Subconsciously, of course, I registered the stories. Honestly, one bit of trauma, one missile injury, one gunshot injury, one bit of disfigurement looks like the other. After a while, they just merge into one. So what you then remember is you remember stories. So the sort of stories I remember are, for example, a 13-year-old. You may know my youngest is 13. He actually turned 14 while I was in Gaza, but he was 13. And this is a 13-year-old that had bullet or shrapnel injuries to his heart and his tummy. When you've got multiple injuries, you have to take on board the most life-threatening sort of injury. So that meant they wanted me to do the operation, so I opened his chest and accessed his heart and opened the covering to the heart and then stitched the holes to his heart together. Because he'd lost so much blood, his heart actually stopped. And because my hands were on his heart, I then had to pump his heart to keep the blood running, the blood that was in his system running, so that the vital organs were still what we call perfused, supplied with blood, even though the heart wasn't doing that job. So, since I've been back, think about these things, that, I had a 13-year-old boy's heart in my hand. By the way, saw him the next day, and his pupils were equal and reactive, which meant he wasn't brain dead, and he was tugging at the tube in his throat, the life support machine tube. It's called an ET tube. So at least, he was alive that day. What's happened to him since, I really don't know. That's a story that I remember. Another story, just a quick one, is like a lady, similarly, shrapnel through the heart, needed an operation to fix the holes in her heart. But she happened to be 7 months pregnant as well. So you had to do a quick cesarean section to deliver the baby and give it to the paediatricians in order to give it some chance of surviving. So you remember these stories? You asked about the psychological impact. I've got a strong family around me. I'm also a man of faith. That helps me as well. But planning for the next mission where I can help, I think I'd feel a lot more affected by it if I didn't feel as though I'm doing anything, but I'm doing what I can, and I've been twice and I'll try to go again. So that keeps me grounded.
You've already said that, you've witnessed all kinds of weaponry and munitions. How did you actually deal with it in your own mindset? Did you ever think, well, one of those could land on me anytime? Or
No,
no, you just never thought about it?
Never thought about it.
Were you ever scared?
There was one night that I was scared, and I'll remember it. It's documented in many places, but it's the 17th of January. And that's when Nasser Hospital was surrounded by the Israeli forces. So the tanks and the fighting was, forget half a kilometre, it's right on the doorstep. Now, we had no internet access, we had no mobile access, we had no way of communicating with the outside or even our organisers, the NGOs. And this was the beginning of the night, and the whole night we were sort of blind, but this was happening, and you didn't know how the story was going to finish. I didn't know how the night was going to end. And you know what Chinese whispers are like, and the Chinese whispers started, and they're coming, and they're only going to take their foreign NGOs, and they'll take them, and all this sort of thing. But then all we did was immerse ourselves in our job, and actually that's the best therapy in that situation. So that was a scary night, just because of the longevity, and we didn't know how it was finished. In terms of missile strikes and gun strikes, if it happens, then it happens. And I suspect you haven't got much time to think about it.
Everybody listening to this and watching this will have probably picked up just how calm and level-toned you are. Something I've known about you for a very long time. How did your colleagues seek reassurance from you? Because I imagine that you were a good point of reference for them because of your calm nature.
So that's one of the things that I try to instill in them, is just staying calm. Because I'll say it again, that if you lose objectivity and you start panicking, the team around you start panicking, everybody starts running around like headless chickens. And you might, as a surgeon, see people running around you like headless chickens thinking, oh, they're trying really hard. But actually, if they're not thinking straight, they're running around like headless chickens and not helping you whatsoever. But that's one of the things that I try to instill within the Gazan surgeons, is that my phrase is slow is fast. So if you do an operation really quickly and roughly, and there's more bleeding as a result of the operation that you do, it just takes longer. If you just slow down and do it a bit more calmly and methodically, you get less bleeding and you actually finish quicker. Now, that's true for what we call elective surgery, planned surgery. Emergent surgery is very different, of course. But those are the sort of intricacies of surgery that I try to introduce into their mindset. It's just gentle hands, slow is fast, and if it looks good, it is good. These are all phrases that I use.
You've already touched on your training role, and you said that the Gazans pick things up very, very quickly. What did you pick up from them?
See, it's not. You see, you pick up things from people that aren't. It's not just technical stuff.
No. I mean, generally.
Generally, it's the dignity of these people. They have been put upon, not just for a year, but for many, many years. They've been encamped within this space and not allowed out or in. They've been limited in terms of instruments, in terms of food and drink for the whole, however many years it's been. There's been a number of assaults in Gaza, as you well know. But the one thing that almost doesn't make sense to me is that how they can maintain this level of dignity and pride. And without fail, every single NGO I've spoken to, and there's been many, that's the thing that you just come away with. How on earth can they maintain that dignity? These are proud people who are actually a decent people, and they are eloquent. And I say this carefully, but you just fall in love with Palestinians when you meet them. And I can't explain that. And as I say, I've seen American, Jordanian, all sorts of NGOs, British NGOs, and everybody says the same thing. You just go away, coming away from a deployment like this saying, well, I want to go back.
What do you think your trips have achieved?
What can one man achieve? I'm just a single person. I'm not sure what they achieve. But what I hope they've achieved is, and by the way, surgeons going from other countries to, in open inverted commas, teach these people trauma surgery. You're not going to teach these people anything about trauma, because actually these surgeons have seen so much of it incessantly for many, many years that actually they teach us. But what you can teach is etiquettes of surgery. What you can tell them is, I've come because I give a damn. Because remember, they don't have internet access sometimes. They don't know what's going on in the wider world. And they think this is happening because people don't care. And honestly, the sort of love and respect that you get from people for coming, for me, it's not, it's no big deal. It's what I should do. Don't thank me, But they just love people coming because they realise actually people out there do care. But it's also relief for the surgeons. Can you imagine being a surgeon in that trauma setting, in that theatre? I mean, I was there for a month. I lost a bit of weight. It was tiring physically and mentally. Again, I'm going to dismiss that now because it's not about me. The reason I use that as a reference is that my counterparts within Gaza have been doing that for 13 months, 14 months now. And some of them have lost their relatives. I know a surgeon that was on call and he went to A&E because A&E, the emergency department, MCI is a mass casualty incident. A mass casualty incident came in and he then realised it was his family and he lost all his family. And they don't know. They come to work and don't know if they're going to find their family back again. And that's actually not an unusual story.
I'm glad you've mentioned family because we're coming to the end, actually. And I wanted to ask you about how your family have felt about you going on such trips and also how they've dealt with it, because it must be really difficult for them to come to terms with as well.
The apple never falls far from the tree, does it? What do I mean by that? I'd like to think that they've got a moral compass. I'd like to think, and I know they think this way. And by the way, I wasn't just, right, I'm going, deal with it. You talk to your family. I talk to my mother, who's still alive. I talk to my wife and my children. You probably know my children. Most of them are earning salaries, so they're old enough to. And in my mind, this sounds crazy, but I'd done my will before I went for the first time, and I've spoken to my children who knew about all my financial affairs. But I went with the peace of mind knowing that if something were to happen to me, and by the way, I thought there's about a 5% chance it'll be crossfire or an accident or something, but, a bit more than me just staying in Dorset, that if that were to happen, then, they're in a position to look after their mother. The children themselves, as I say, they hopefully think in a similar way. And I've said this many times before, this isn't about race, religion, colour, creed. This is just purely about humanity. And I would challenge anybody, I'd hate to take anybody with me, but challenge anybody to see the sort of things that I've seen and to not say, okay, hold on, enough's enough, stop. Let's let aid get in. Let's let medical equipment and instruments and supplies get in. Let's let water get in. Let's let food get in because, it was enough at 100 deaths or 1,000 deaths or 10,000 deaths or 20,000 deaths. So, as I say, most of my children are off an age where they can make their own informed decisions and they realise that, if you're in a position to help somebody, help. What I've also said to people is that, why would you go? I can't control where I was born, and I've been born into privilege because I've been born into freedom. I've been sort of clothed and fed by my parents, educated, and got to the position I'm in. I could have been born over there, and if I was born over there, I'd be crying for help. So this is just, it was there for the grace of God that, that could have been me, and it's just trying to do the right thing.
Can you remember the first thing your wife said to you when you got back at the end of October?
When you're going back? No. So she's a very quiet person, and it's just, a hug says everything, doesn't it? You don't need to say anything. So,
yeah. Well, Taz, time's up. But I think we've still got an awful lot that we could talk about here, and maybe I can get you to come back and we can talk some more and talk some more about some of the things that you do in the local area as well, because I know quite a lot of your history nowadays, and there is a lot to discuss. It's just extraordinary what you have done and what you continue to do. So thanks very much again, Taz.
Chris, thank you very much.
Well, please subscribe to the podcast and join me again for the next episode of Leading Lives through Hallmark Productions at the Login.